We often look at the exploration and colonization of the Americas as a one-way process. Today, we're going to explore the influence of the Americas on Tudor England and beyond. Hello, my name is Gareth Edwards and welcome to the Untitled History Podcast. Join me each week alongside world-leading experts as we take a deep dive into your favourite topics from throughout history. From the ancient world to the modern, and with plenty of historical rabbit holes in between, we'll cover famous and not so famous moments in history from all across the globe. The 16th century saw a two-way exchange of objects, ideas and people between Europe and the Americas to a far greater extent than is often understood. Much of that exchange is visible in the everyday objects and trade that took place between these two different worlds. Exchange that can get lost when we frame history through the eyes and acts of individuals of recognition, renown or infamy. And to explore that exchange today, I'm delighted to be joined by Lauren Working. Say hello, Lauren.
Hello, delighted to be here.
So for those unfamiliar with Lauren's work, Lauren is a historian at the University of York, which has excellent duck ponds from memory, who specialises in literary sociability, material culture, and colonisation in the age of Shakespeare. Her academic work includes the making of an Imperial Polity, Civility and America in the Jacobean Metropolis, which is published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, and a new introduction to the Tempest for Oxford World's Classics. A Golden World, How the Americas Transformed Renaissance England actually just came out a few weeks ago, and that's her first trade book. And it's also one of the reasons I wanted you on this show, because when I was scrambling around for who can talk about the back and forth between America and England, rather than just as in a one way, it was just before your book came out, and I was like, this is the perfect opportunity. So thank you so much for coming on for this.
Thank you. I'm very excited to chat about this.
So maybe it'd be useful for us to start by giving people a bit of a general context for the period we're in here, because I talked in the intro about Tudors, about this being the Tudor era and the Tudor exchange and back and forth. But what does that really mean on the ground? What kind of level of colonization and influence and exploration are we at in this period that we're talking about?
Yeah, the English are fascinated by the Americas, but they're also quite late to the game. So they're really lagging behind the Spanish and Portuguese, who have basically been trying to colonize parts of the Americas for nearly a century by the time the English tried to establish their first colony. And it's really around the 1570s and 1580s where the English, where particular kind of gentlemen and sailors who have these ideas for places they might go are petitioning Elizabeth for permission to kind of officially, loosely under the banner of the crown, lay claims to territories in the Atlantic beyond Ireland. So this is also the moment when the English are really in these renewed campaigns to colonize Ireland as well. And so part of that, I think, is coming out of those experiences with the English fighting the Gaelic Irish. Often there are captains and seafarers such as Drake and Raleigh, Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, who are involved kind of in Ireland first before they go to the Americas. But really, it's only in the mid-1580s, starting with Roanoke, a small island off the coast of North Carolina, that the English actually lay claim to an indigenous territory. That fails. And it's only fast forward to James VI and First Reign in 1607 that the English established Jamestown, which becomes known as kind of the first successful English colony in the Americas. So there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of traveling to these places by English explorers. But even though the English like to claim that they're basically an empire now, they don't have a lot to show for it until really towards the end of James's reign in 1625, where they have little claims to places in the Caribbean, in North America, Bermuda, Newfoundland. All of that comes under the aegis of the English crown in that period.
And this is kind of the thing, isn't it? We're in a period where, listeners, it's probably best to think of England or Britain as it will become as the empire in which the sun will never set, as this vast swathes of red painted on the map. That is not the case in this period. We're looking at a period where it's almost, particularly within the Americas context, it's just these little dots of red are starting to pop up in places as Lauren described. So I think And it's a lot of this is these captains, these sailors that are coming out of that first period, golden period of exploration, of war with Spain an awful lot, more than anything else.
Yeah, that is key.
They are seafarers. And so you've mentioned a couple of names there already. You've mentioned Drake and Raleigh, and Raleigh's going to show up, I suspect, a fair bit in everything we talk about today. But I mean, I also want to highlight Martin Frobisher. So Frobisher is born in 1535. He's another one of these. The English might call him an explorer. The Spanish might call him a pirate. There is an element of this, I think, to all of these figures. But they're all pushing as much to find economic exploration as much as it is for the joy of exploration. It's how do we get into this colonial game? What resources can we exploit? How do we create permanent outposts that can be expanded? And how do we make sure these things are defensible from the Spanish and others? And how can we use these places to annoy the Spanish and others? So that's probably, is there anything you feel we need to add to the context for people to understand?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly right, the economic side of things. And this is why I was like, I have to start the book with a chapter on Frobisher because he's so obsessed with finding gold in the Arctic, which I know sounds really zany to us now. And it's incredible how much he garners support in London for the search for the Northwest Passage. So he's really trying to do what Columbus was trying to do and find a passage to China, to India, to the wealth of the East, but by traveling west. And so I really wanted to get through, even in my title, A Golden World, that a lot of times when the English, even though they have these very vaulted ideological ideas about, conversion and the good of the state, and I think they do believe in those things being important, but it is economic need as well that's really fueling the kind of feverish searches for gold, first by Martin Frobisher in Nunavut, or what we call Canada, and then also Walter Raleigh in his voyages to South America as well.
It's one thing that really, really stuck out for me, and it's, again, one of the reasons I wanted you on, is because I've always been fascinated by that. I think what Frobisher is doing up top, let's say, often gets kind of overlooked, when actually the economic goal is exactly as the same as what's happening down below. It's this obsession with either we need to find shorter routes to the other side of the world, or we need to find access to resources that increasingly England is having to import, because trade and industry and construction and economies are becoming much more intertwined and diverse in terms of the goods they require. And, you can't just suddenly domestically produce everything anymore in the same way as you could. And when you're in a world where at any point you might be hostile to France, you might be hostile to Spain, finding additional sources of gold, of silver, of wood, of high quality wood, as I think we'll talk about a bit in a while. Like, these things are absolute drivers for that exploration and expansion. And as you say, Frobisher, so listeners, his first expedition to try and find the Northwest Passage effectively arrives in the area in 1576. So it's exactly as like right in the middle of that period that Lauren's talking about. And I think that's the Gabriel and the Michael of the ships he uses for that. But it's financed by everyone who's like, there might be gold. If we can't find the Northwest Passage, there's going to be gold here. And he thinks for a while he's found vast reserves of gold. Isn't it pyrites, I think he ends up finding a lot of?
Real failure. Yeah.
But I mean, that maybe brings us nicely onto maybe when we were talking about this before the show, we were talking about ways to frame this and get the idea across to people. And I think it was really nice to maybe look at it through a few individual goods or individual people, which is very similar actually to how you framed it in the book. So listeners, we'll talk a bit more about the book at the end properly, but in a way, think of this as the cool stuff you're going to get in the book. But let's talk a bit about, not about Frobisher, but directly as himself. But as we say, what it is it that he encounters and what stands out to him and what then ripples back to England from his early expeditions?
Yeah, well, what I think is really interesting is that he's obsessed with finding gold. He obviously never does. But what the English are actually finding and encountering are people, right? And an entirely new society and communities that they know very little about. In this case, the Inuit. And so I really wanted to bring to the fore that there's so much around, Frobisher never found gold. And this is quite a fun story of like daring, and quintessential Elizabethan bravado. And that's certainly the the reputation that Frobisher kind of wants for himself. But when you read the accounts of travelers who have been with Frobisher on his journey, what they're really fascinated by are the clothes that the Inuit wear. I mean, they're really impressed by the technology that is needed to kind of survive in these very difficult conditions when, everything freezes over in the autumn and winter. And it's actually around this time of year that we're in now that Frobisher is traveling, because he knows, he has to kind of avoid the ice flows that are going to start to build up if he delays. And so there's a lot of discussion in the archives about sealskin garments, about the parkas and the snowshoes that the Inuit wear. And there's also something that I didn't know as much about when I started reading, but I was so fascinated that that the English are really interested in the kind of kayaks as well that the Inuit have. They're really impressed by how speedy the Inuit are in these kayaks. And so it's really that encounter with materials, with sealskin, with animal gut that's being used to make the kayaks, that I kind of wanted to bring to the fore in the chapter as well, because I think that's a less expected way to think about these voyages.
I do love that. I mean, it's something I'd noticed in accounts, and I was in Canada a few years back and had a brilliant art exhibition on various bits and literature bits showing some of the accounts that come back from these early explorers, and also some of the kind of the woodcuts or illustrations that are either created there or are created back in London when people get back. Much of which, as we both know, like a lot of it just doesn't survive anymore. But there are snippets around. And it always, as a maritime historian, as a naval historian by background, my spidey sense is always pinged when I see English people abroad looking at how other people make boats and ships. Because whatever the issues around cultural difference or racism or whatever else, or, if any age, you can always see this aspect of eventually someone looks at that and goes, hang on, that's a really good way of making your boats move faster on water. We should look at what we could steal in knowledge terms from that. Hang on, the way they make those objects, the way they use sealskin, the way they keep themselves insulated, we should copy that. And it's really always interesting to me that you almost, in this era, you often see more of a willingness to accept that than you then get once you hit the Victorian era, once you hit the high imperial era, when it becomes a lot more, well, what could these people possibly teach us?
Yeah. There's a slipperiness in the term that the English sometimes use to describe various peoples across the Americas, which obviously we would never use today and which is really problematic. But when they use the word savage, and I'm putting that in inverted quotations, but when they use the word savage, it does have it can be a bit derogatory, but it can also be a reference to that French word sauvage, which means wild, which again does come with its own cultural connotations, but there is a little bit of this sense of they're wild in that they don't live in cities as we perceive them, but they do have these flourishing societies. And as you say, there is a bit of curiosity around understanding the various arts and technologies. I really found that exactly as you say, in relation to the boats, that the kayaks are really trying to describe them. I almost feel like there's maybe a little bit of a sense of competition, right? That many of the crew on Frobisher's voyages probably grew up along the coast in England and kind of grew up on boats, and they're thinking, how can this person go so swiftly through these regions and navigate them so expertly? And I think they are really fascinated. But even from this voyage, there are stories of captives and kind of, a kind of darker side to those exchanges as well, which I think is an integral part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's really critical, as I was going to say, is like, we can't forget the human aspect of this, and that is a human trade as much as it is a trade in ideas. I mean, I think Frobisher himself brings 4 members of the Inuit community back with him between 1576. So it is that first expedition, I think.
From the very first expedition, he brings 1 man back. He's not named in the archives. We don't know what his name was, but 1 man in that first expedition. And then in his second expedition in 1577, so just the following year, he brings back Kalicho, Arnak, and Mutak. Kalicho is an Inuk man Arnak is an Inuk woman, and Nutak is her infant child. And they're not a family. They're captured separately. So the child seems to be this woman's in all likelihood, but she doesn't actually know the man. And we have accounts of them being thrown together in the ship and at first being really mistrustful of each other because they're coming from different kind of communities and may not even have spoken the same dialects. And through the course of the voyage, according to the English sources, they kind of warm to each other and, step into Bristol together when they arrive in England and perhaps kind of supported each other through that. But unfortunately, all four of these captives, we know they were taken against their will because they're wounded in kind of fights with the English. All four of them die in England within months of arriving.
And I think it can be sometimes really easy or I often see, less so now, but you used to see a lot that dismissed to a certain extent. So, these people are brought back, they're on display, they cause a huge storm, and sadly they die. And then, okay, let's get on with the story. I do think maybe it's good to consider here and say that, and look and say, actually, what was the genuine impact in those? We know that they arrived back in Bristol. We know that there's a certain amount of spectacle and economic activity that almost relates to them. And I think we can understand a lot about what people like Frobisher were trying to achieve, what England was trying to achieve by the interactions that happen to them when they are back at court. Do you feel it would be fair to describe those interactions as, in one way, promotional for the people who are doing these expeditions, and in another way, as frankly, as revenue generation?
Yes, these voyages are expensive. And Martin Frobisher wants to be, I think, probably remembered, make a kind of legacy for himself. To do that, he needs the voyages to be successful. He's gone a couple times. He hasn't found anything. He hasn't come back to England in glory with all his ships laden with gold. And so there is an important kind of, going back to that idea of economics, of trying to convince investors basically in London to put money towards these voyages. Investors, including Queen Elizabeth herself. And also your listeners might know John Dee, who's this kind of eccentric astrologer at Elizabeth's court. He's also supportive of these ventures. So trying to drum up support by displaying or inviting people to come and see the people who come from those places. They are seen so Calicho goes in one of his kayaks kind of around the kind of waterways of Bristol, and I think is fishing when he's there and kind of impressing people. So people are curious, but we get this kind of, it's this kind of, I think, ominous to us sense of that forced display and spectatorship that comes with trying to get support for these ventures. We might think of the later reference in the Tempest from 1611, where the jester Trinculo says that in London, people won't pay to relieve like an injured beggar, but they will pay to see a dead Indian, as he says, which I think is like the same. You see that happening from these early voyages, that people are really fascinated by the Americas, but the costs of that are human lives.
And I mean, like Frobisher's getting paintings done of them and selling them to,
they hang
aristocrats to show in
their
their
they
house,
hang in Hampton Court. Yep.
I mean, several of the things we touched on there, I think, move nicely into some of the other areas we're going to explore. But just before we do, I think it is worth us almost finishing on that painting note, and maybe I always think, and again, you cover it in the book really nicely, is that the painting of Frobisher in the Bodleian Library in Oxford is a really, really perfect example of someone going, this is how I want to be seen by the world. And there's, he's got his pistols, he's got his guns, he's got his navigation instruments. He's a conqueror and an explorer. But something I'd never really thought about until you flagged it in the book is there's those elements of sealskin and coat in there as well. Even there, in his grand vision of iconography, already the Americas are bleeding in.
Yeah, and he's so obsessed with gold that I feel like even just this kind of burnished yellow color that he's wearing of a doublet, again, expertly made probably within England by artisans and kind of the hard work of servants and things, manipulating skins and fabrics. Remembering that Martin Frobisher is born to a merchant family, but not particularly prominent, this is a full-length portrait as well, right? He's like, don't just catch like my, a little shoulders and head kind of glimpse of me. He's getting the same portraits that the wealthiest courtiers in the realm are getting of their full bodies. The gun is really rare as well. It's really rare to find a gun in an English portrait in this time. So there is that kind of civility, status projecting, and really explicit show of violence, all beautifully packaged in this very propagandistic image that anyone can go see at the Bodleian Library. It's in one of the main areas. He's just sitting up there on the wall. So go have a look yourself. Yeah.
Well, let's drift slightly. Let's drift southwards in our canoe. Well, moving to canoes rather than kayaks, I suppose. But let's talk a bit about events and this exchange of culture and ideas, and in this case, actually language in some ways, that happens further south. And let's talk about what's happening around Roanoke. Thomas Harriot is probably our way into this. And again, you talk about quite a lot in the book, and is a fascinating figure in his own right. But let's use him as the starter of the window into this. So do you want to give people a bit of a rough idea of who Thomas Harriot was?
Yes.
And how he ended up in that area?
He is an associate of Raleigh. He is a very skilled navigator. He's been to Oxford to study all the latest information about navigation. So you can imagine why those who are interested in colonial projecting set their eyes on his usefulness. But he's really seen as a polymath as well. He's interested in all kinds of, what we might call science, natural philosophy. So he has the kind of technical expertise of a mathematician, a scientist, but he's also very interested in languages and kind of global cultures as well. So he ends up in Walter Raleigh's entourage. And Walter Raleigh sends a reconnaissance mission to Roanoke off the coast of North Carolina in 1584. And the sailors return with two Algonquin men, Manteo and Winchese. And Harriot lives with them in Raleigh's mansion on the Strand and basically learns Algonquin dialects from them. And then he transcribes their language into a kind of written form. Sadly, this document does not survive, which is extremely frustrating. But it becomes the basis for him growing more and more interested in Indigenous Americans and their cultures. And in June 1585, so again, around this time of year, he sails to Roanoke and he stays there for about a year. He gets snapped up by Francis Drake, who's returning from his raids in the Caribbean on the way back and returns to England after that. But he spends a good kind of year in Roanoke.
So that's Thomas's moment of glory. So moving away from him now and talking about the world he gives us an insight into. What is it that's standing out to explorers and settlers there? What is the cultural and sort of technological bleed through that England starts to see from the communities that the Roanoke settlers and others are interacting with?
They're really fascinated by the Algonquins who live in that area. And because Harriet can speak the language, they're already kind of able to communicate in ways that haven't really been possible before. And Harriet writes a text that's published a few years after he comes back from his voyages. So in 1585, he publishes a brief and true report of the newfound land of Virginia, Virginia being a kind of catch-all term for the English that encompasses everything basically from Florida up to Virginia and New England. So a lot of the text is about commodities. He uses the word commodity and thinking about resources from the area that will be useful to the English. But what I love about Harriet's text is he doesn't always try to explain things that he doesn't understand. So he will just say, this is how the people do this in this region. I don't really know how they do this, or I don't know enough to give you more details. So rather than trying to really just fit Algonquins purely within an English way of understanding the world, he's kind of sensitive to the gaps in knowledge that exist between the English and Algonquins as they tried to understand each other.
And what I like about that is it, in a way, gives us far more of a perspective into what the reality was on the ground there. Because what he's not doing, as you say, is he's not interpreting, he's not filling in the gaps. And actually, that means it's far easier to work out, actually, what is going on and what is just someone making stuff up. I mean, we'll talk about him a bit later in that regard, but Raleigh's the worst for that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, and again, like with my naval historian hat, and one thing I find fascinating about all of that is, once again, so much of the talk is about canoes. Like, it's canoes and wood.
It is. And I love that in his account. And I love this image of kind of all kinds of Elizabethan furniture basically being made out of Carolina wood, basically, because he says, oh, this wood is, these cedars and these different woods are of such good durability and color that they would make amazing lutes and they would make amazing beds. And so he's thinking commercially, but I love this idea of the Algonquin environment actually entering into English interiors that we think are so, when we come into a Jacobean house and we see all the woodwork, we think, oh, that's so quintessentially Jacobean. But to think that maybe some wood that actually got to that, some of the timber that's actually being used for some of the furniture could come from North America is really fascinating.
Well, and just accounts again of like the discussions on, okay, well, they're making these wonderful canoes effectively out of single giant trees and everything else. And then suddenly you've got the Royal Navy sniffing around and going, that's quite nice.
Yes.
Would that stuff be great for masts?
Yep. Exactly. Towards the end, one of the words I'm really fascinated by that I talk about in the chapter in the book is rackiock. So it's an indigenous term for this wood. And Harriet just has no idea what kind of wood it is. And we actually don't know either what wood he was referring to. Now, scholars have guessed that maybe it's a white cedar, something like that. But he says the Algonquins make their canoes, as you say, the kind of dugout canoes. So they're made out of a single trunk of a tree and really expertly hollowed out. And Harriet just doesn't try to translate the name of the wood really, because he just can't tell what it is. So he just has to use this word rackiock throughout. And because his text is so influential on later texts, even by the time we get to John Smith writing in the 1620s, he's saying, oh, and there's also kind of wood in the region called rackiock, and that's all we know about it. So I love that it's a word that kind of resists assimilation, and it just allows us to linger on that moment of English interest in Algonquin life, but also their inability to fully kind of subsume it or make sense of it. And I think actually that moment of misunderstanding or of not trying to just gloss over what's difficult or unknown is really productive for us as historians. That sometimes we come across languages or encounters and we want to make tidy sense of them, but we can't.
Yeah, I think there's a real beauty to that. It's like, it's the unknowable. And I think sometimes there can be a temptation to be afraid of that. And actually, I've loved that about being a historian. I love the idea of being able to say, actually, we're just not going to know. No. Whether it's the records around that were burnt, whether it was the person who was there didn't write it down, whether it was they didn't bother, they never worked out how to translate the phrase, so they didn't bother. I find those glimpses into the mystery of history are actually what makes it feel real in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah, we get so obsessed with our sources, and what survives, but so much doesn't as well, that it's just this little reminder that there's so much that we're missing out on, but also that we don't need to try to explain.
So let's jump further south now. And actually, when we were first talking about what to cover in this episode, there was one thing that you said to me, like, we definitely need to talk about this. And I love this as a subject because, again, it's one of those rabbit holes that I have very much fallen down since both starting to read your work and other bits, because I just not thought about it in this context. And let's talk about pearls. So when we're talking about pearls in the context of America or Americas, where are we starting this journey? Where are we starting with the story of pearls and South America?
Yeah, well, we're starting with the late 15th century voyages by Columbus and Vespucci, really, because it's in those late 1490s expeditions that the Spanish realize that there are huge stores of pearls available in the Atlantic Ocean. And that actually those kind of in the northern parts of South America, the coastline of Venezuela, the islands off the coast of Venezuela, Cumana and Cubagua Islands, for example, that these are rife with pearls. And that they are, at least in the sources, this is what is claimed, that they're much bigger and costlier than those that have come to Europeans from the Indian Ocean, because of course pearls have been around for a very long time. And they can even be found, freshwater pearls and things in Scotland or in Sweden. So it isn't that pearls don't exist before Europeans go to the Americas, but we see this insane explosion of pearls coming back to Europe. Sometimes the English are acquiring them via cities such as Seville or Paris. But then, of course, during that height of war with Spain, with all the piracy going on, with the voyages of Drake, etc., they're also coming firsthand from these intercepted cargoes and things around that region.
And like you say, like pearls have been a human obsession in various ways since Roman times. Like we go back, I'm a kid who grew up on my Asterix comics. And one of the things, first time I remember reading about pearls is in Asterix and Cleopatra, where they have a running joke that she keeps drinking glasses of wine that have got a pearl in them, which is, of course, a reference to Pliny, I think it is, who talks about, basically for a bet, she pulls a pearl out of her ear and dissolves it in vinegar and then drinks it.
It's a pretty gutsy move.
Yeah, and it's like, so my full knowledge of that originally came from Asterix comics. But I think listeners, you really have to understand the scale of the demand for pearls and the explosion that Lauren's talking about here. I mean, on a statistic level, Charles V of Spain, he gets a chunk of everything that comes back from the Americas. That's almost his tithe. I think it's called the fifth, I think. But over the course of his reign, I think he gets about 35 million pearls.
Yes.
And that's his
share.
His fifth.
Yeah.
That's his share. So that's how many pearls are coming back just in the Spanish side of this. So you can understand, listeners, why the English want in on this. Not least because there's a certain character who really, really, really loves pearls at the royal court at this time, isn't there? And it's Elizabeth.
Yes. And it's very handy, right, that she's trying to position herself as the Virgin Queen, right? Because what is in some ways more virginal than this white pearlescent, these pearls. Molly Warsh has a book called American Baroque where she writes really nicely about the kind of dual nature of pearls, that on one hand, they're often associated with the Virgin Mary, with virginity, with purity, with whiteness. But they also come from oysters and are often, which is often kind of slang for female genitalia in the period. And so there's actually quite a kind of crass or saucier side to the association with pearls as well. So it's interesting because they serve this kind of dual function. But as you say, Elizabeth is obsessed with them. And think of any portrait, of the Elizabethan court, and chances are there are going to be some pearls in there. Sometimes there's...
I saw an account a while back that described a very, very loose analogy and said, think of it as the weird sort of dual iconography that can happen around, say, school uniforms. That actually, if you look in, say, Japan, places like that weird kind of, oh no, it's an innocent thing, but also then you've got the whole sexy schoolgirl, Britney Spears thing. And there's this weird borderlands that if you can find something that displays that, it becomes very popular.
Yes. Yeah. There's a portrait of the time at Tate Britain of a woman who is every single inch of her dress is covered in pearls, like every single possible swathe of fabric. And she's pregnant. So, for her, the pearls aren't a symbol of virginity. They're a symbol of this like fertility that she's in this patriarchal society where she's expected to bear heirs to her husband. The pearls almost turn her into, they encase her in this pearly whiteness. And so there's the kind of virginal aspect, but there's also this idea of the fecundity of the ocean. And I think the English, they're a seafaring nation who are increasingly wanting to promote themselves as such. Having all these gems from the sea makes a lot of sense.
And the shift to the Americas and the access to what comes known as the Pearl Coast, doesn't it, I think, which is basically, think Venezuela, listeners. If you're think top of South America, Venezuela, that is the rough area we're talking about here. But this ultimately, again, as we talked about right at the beginning, this has its dark side. This is an exchange of goods and looking for that new source of pearls and those coming back. But this is forever also then linked to the British are looking at how can we do this around Bermuda, and Bermuda will ultimately become a huge slave plantation. And a lot of that starts here with the transfer of African workers by both the Spanish and the English as pearl divers.
Yeah, so the earliest recorded Black and Indigenous individuals who come to Bermuda almost as soon as the English arrive there. So they're there by 1612. So the English are shipwrecked aboard onto Bermuda in 1609. And that's, again, you might think of the Tempest is often thought to have been influenced by one of these accounts of shipwreck. And within a couple years, the Earl of Warwick, who's this really prominent Puritan privateer, who really wants to combat the Spanish in the Americas. And there are several African and Indigenous pearl divers and tobacco cultivators who arrive. So we immediately get that sense of projectors thinking, okay, what's going to be most lucrative here? And then really hoping that pearls are going to be the thing that they're going to find. So they put a lot of money in trying to get an industry, the kind of fishing industry going. But unfortunately, everything they find is very small and not the huge Baroque pearls that are so popular. But the fact that the first known Africans to arrive on the island are these skilled pearl divers remind us, I think, that it's African labor that is behind a lot of the pearls that end up in Tudor England as well. These are obviously not farmed pearls like we have today. So every single pearl has been hand picked from under the ocean in these perilous conditions where divers are forced to dive down into these perilous depths that can permanently damage their health. And of course, not all oysters contain pearls. So there's so much labor. You were talking about the 30 million pearls that Charles V receives. How many more oysters had to be plucked from the sea, even just to find those pearls? And so there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of ecological and human devastation that is involved with all those little beautiful dangly pearls that we see in all the portraits of the time.
And I think my last comment on that one would be that listeners don't even just think of this as being pearls that are worn on dresses. Like if you read accounts, if you're a sailor, if you're a seafarer, and you've claimed that you've visited the Americas or you've sailed on those voyages and you're in an inn somewhere, you're sitting there having a drink with people and they're like, yeah, of course you have, mate. Of course you've been there. Actually, one of the ways you might show that you actually have been to those areas and do things is you might reach into your pocket and you'll pull out a small pearl and you go, that's the evidence I've been on these voyages. Now, whether it is or not, or whether you acquired it another way, is a different story.
Yes.
But the fact that pearls acquire that symbology in relation to the Americas is fascinating to me, I think.
Yeah, and my chapter on pearls in the book is called Boy with a Pearl Earring, because it's not just women. Like men are, Raleigh's wearing head to toe pearls as well. He's got pearls on his scabbard. He's got pearls, a double pearl earring in one of his surviving portraits from the height of his popularity with Elizabeth. And so I do think it becomes really tied up with that kind of seafaring masculinity that explorers are traveling to the Americas, they're coming back, they're wearing these really ostentatious pearls. And I think we're meant, exactly as you say, to make those Atlantic associations when we look at them.
Now, we're running out of time on the main podcast, but I don't want us to not cover this at all on the main podcast because it is one of my favorite bits. But we'll talk a bit more about Raleigh and why he's carrying this particular object and his weird quests along the Orinoco Delta in the extra bit for subscribers. But I do want to touch on something first. So I'm going to tee you up for this one. So Lauren, would you like to tell us what one of the odd things that's found on Raleigh's person when in 1618 when he's in disgrace, he's trying to flee to France? Because it's not just his kind of general useful things that's found on his person, is it? Or what we would regard as useful. There's a rather interesting object that's found on him as well. Do you want to describe it?
Yes, this document is amazing. And as you can probably see from me already getting excited, but it was like finding this in the National Archives. I was so obsessed with it. So this is an inventory that is drawn up, as you say, very near his execution in 1618. He's trying to flee to France because he knows he's going to be executed. He knows James hates him and isn't going to just put him in the Tower again.
And listeners, do not underestimate how much King James actively dislikes Walter Raleigh. Yeah. We could do an entire podcast on how much he dislikes Walter Raleigh.
And so Walter Raleigh is like, okay, I'm going to France then. And he's caught. It's kind of a half-hearted attempt. He perhaps, knew he wasn't really going to make it. But when he's captured, authorities draw up an inventory of everything that he's carrying with him at his arrest. And one of the things on the list, in fact, the first thing that appears on this inventory is just this description that appears in the record as a Guyana idol of gold and copper. And that's the only information we get about it. And so when I first read that, I just thought, okay, what is this Guyana idol that they're talking about? There's that very Protestant language, right, that's being used to describe it. There's a lot of loaded assumptions behind the word idol. This idea that it's a pagan object, but then also its materials are important. The description that it's made of gold, exciting, something from South America that's made out of gold. And but the clue is in that combination of metals, so that it is gold and copper. And that's what kind of brought me on this quest of my own to kind of figure out more about these objects, which are now known as tumbaga. So they're indigenous made. In this case, if it is from Guyana, which is the kind of region in present-day Guyana, but also Venezuela that Raleigh was visiting, it's likely an Arawakan-made figure. Surviving examples are crescents, eagles, frogs. So it could have been maybe an animal shape. And yeah, I just wanted to know why Raleigh, when he's trying to escape and is like on the cusp of death, is carrying this idol with him, which is something we've never really thought about in terms of Raleigh's interest in South America. And so I kind of wanted to use that as the basis for revisiting things like Walter Raleigh's account of his voyage and kind of think through metallurgy. And again, flipping that idea of the English are so obsessed with going to Guyana and getting gold, but don't find any. It's like, well, actually, they are bringing really cool indigenous-made gold and copper objects with them to England. So what does that say about this moment?
And like, we'll talk a bit more about that in the extra bit in a minute. But like, I do think it was one of those things that I'd not obviously known about, but not even thought about until I read your account of it. And it's almost, to bring it back to the beginning, it just feels to me like a bit like Frobisher bringing pyrite back. It's that thing of that, as we talked about at the beginning, these are economic quests. It's a desperate quest to prove that you should fund another, guys, fund me on another expedition, please, because look, here's the kind of things I can bring back. And like you say, it's an alloy figure. It's the copper and gold together. And it's depletion gilding, is it? I think it's described as. But like, A, the technical ability that has to go into producing that, but B, that again, you end up with an object that looks like it's pure gold. And you do have to wonder and go, is Raleigh carrying that? Because if he does make it to France, he's hoping that someone's going to fund him to go on another trip down that way again.
Yes. I mean, some of the other things that are listed in the inventory as well as that is a diamond ring that Elizabeth had once given him, and reports of chemical trials on other bits of metals and things that were found in South America, and some maps, some top secret maps of the region as well. So he's just stuffed full of all these materials and this information from South America. He's when he travels back, he brings several indigenous peoples back with him as well, as he did with his first voyage. Are they in his entourage as well? I mean, we don't know, but it is really fascinating.
Well, we'll wrap up the main podcast there. But Lauren, thank you very much for joining me on this. This is like, I find this whole thing fascinating. Your book on it's great as well. I really love it as the approach you take. Do you want to tell people a bit about how you approached this in the book? Because the things we've talked about here are actually things that are covered in the book, but there's so much more in there as well. But like, what did you look to try and cover? How did you structure it? Why did you structure it the way it is? It's very readable, listeners, by the way. Don't feel you need to come into this as an expert. It walks you through the understanding of all of this. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's got 17 chapters. So we've talked about maybe kind of 3 of the objects and the places in the book, but I've got 17 chapters. And for me, objects were kind of the way through that I wanted to use as the focal point to describe these things. As you kind of mentioned in your introduction, I think we often think of the English kind of going out and settling in parts of the Americas and the kind of legacies of them colonizing various regions. And I really wanted to think about things from the other way and to think about the objects that are coming from the Americas and how that might give us a new sense of the life of the Tudors and Stuarts. And so the objects were a good way, I think, for me to connect Indigenous peoples, Indigenous makers, landscapes from the Americas, ecological particularities of those places the English are going to, and to really think about these materials and properties acting in some way, acting on the world of the Tudors. So yeah, there are beavers, there are guinea pigs, there are silver coins, all kinds of trade-based materials, but also Indigenous-made artifacts that I think just really show us that two-way nature of encounter, that colonization is something that is as much about kind of unsettlement and travel and cultural transfer as it is about attempted settlement.
There's a great chapter in there, or I think it's a great chapter on Colombian emeralds and the Cheapside Hoard, which we absolutely do not have time to talk about, sadly, but we would if we had a lot more time. But if you want my tip to people to go out and buy this and read it and do everything else, the chapter on Colombian emeralds is great. Well, I will say it because you've been very polite and not done it, but the book is, of course, available on Amazon, on bookshop.org, on Kobo. I've got my ebook version on Kobo. So go out and get it, buy it. It's a great book. And listeners, thank you as always for listening. Don't forget, as we're a more general history podcast, it does make it harder for us to get into people algorithms. Like if you're doing a podcast about Hitler's secret sharks, you can just very easily get onto YouTube and do everything like that. But so much of our reach is dependent on you, the listener, telling other people that you've enjoyed this and sharing episodes you like with other people. So if you've enjoyed this show, like, subscribe, comment on your platform of choice. It really genuinely does help. But also, just WhatsApp a link to some of your friends. If you've listened to this episode and gone, you know what, I know someone who'd really, really find this fascinating, copy the link and tell them about it right now, because that'll help us and it'll spread the word and hopefully gives Lauren some book sales as well, because they'd be very well deserved. But Lauren, thank you for coming on, and we'll wrap up the main section here. So is there anything else you want to say to our main episode listeners before we start talking about Walter Raleigh and his weird obsession with finding the City of Gold?
Oh God, no, let's get on to Raleigh. I'm just too excited.
So listeners, don't forget you can subscribe if you're not already on untitled-history.com. That is going to get you both access to versions of this podcast without adverts, but also all the conversation that me and Lauren are about to have, and also all the previous extra bits and conversations I've had with other people. So don't forget to subscribe that way, and then you get so much more content. And there's even things like hats and t-shirts you can buy as well. Although, good God, do not buy a hoodie in the middle of a heat wave as we're recording this episode now. But yeah, thank you for listening. You've been listening to the Untitled History Podcast, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, why not head over to our dedicated supporter page? There, for the cost of a cup of tea, you can decide which subjects we cover next, get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, and join a community of like-minded people. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. And to explore that exchange today, I'm delighted to be joined by Lauren It's working, isn't it? I keep wanting to call you Woking.
People do that. Don't worry.
Yeah. But right. I think let's both find
Let's go
cold
turn our
things.
air conditioning on.
Air conditioning's going back on. Cool.